That's okay.
We can squish it.
Tell us we're gaining weight, Terry.
I think so.
Good morning, Jim. How are you?
I'm just fine. Is he gonna give me some kind of a cue when he?
You're good, Jim.
You're good,
Okay.
Jim.
Well, good morning, everybody at Mountain View.
Morning.
I'm Elder Schwemm, the other Jim, and I'm here filling in for Bill this morning. I'm not going to pick up his line of thought and continue on where he's with his presentation. So I thought there was something that would be more effective without disturbing his line of thought would be to touch on something that is kind of fundamental to everything that we think about, and we don't always stop to really look into it maybe as much as we could have and should have. And that's time. God created this whole world for us, for mankind. But God is above time, and we're not. So we have to work with time. And that kind of is different. There was a time when, in the creation week, when he created Adam and Eve and gave mankind a conscience and said, go out there and do a good thing. And that didn't work so well. So then he tried to help us to guide mankind again. And after the flood, when he cleaned things up, he talked to Noah and gave him some rules and said that, it's now your time to go out and try this over again and see if we could do it, even better. Well, that didn't really work either. So they got a little bit more formal and decided that he'd develop a special nation to be as a front for something that everybody could look up to and see, and that was the Hebrew nation. When he created the Hebrew nation, he gave them not only the basic concepts, but he gave them a lot of laws and regulations to go along with the guidance. So a much more structured deal. So with more structure, we needed to become more aware of time, because you can't be there on time if you don't know what time is supposed to be. So kind of, that's looking at it from our standpoint. So what he did was that he gave them obligations. So they had to bring time into their daily life, because he assigned holidays for them that were supposed to occur on a particular day at a particular time on that day. So the world had to go from when you kind of got around to it when you wanted to, because the seasons change gradually and whatever, and we got a lot of time to get something done, so we had a lot of time to procrastinate. But as we got into a more structured society, things had to be done a lot more. So what the Hebrews ended up practicing was that they developed a pattern of way of looking at everything. They looked at the how long it took for the seasons to completely come back to being the same again, and we call that kind of like a year. And then we noticed that there were intermediate changes on a smaller scale during out that period, and we kind of call those like the 4 seasons of the years, or maybe the months. And then we get down to, we noticed that there was something else that occurred even more obvious to everybody, and that was the day. We lost light and gained light and this happened on a real regular basis. And so everything seemed to fit into a plan. So what they had to do was to recognize the plan so they could project ahead and try to use it to their advantage. So first off, and I'm not exactly sure yet, but the entire world thought that the year concept would take about 360 days. And that's pretty much everybody, not just the Hebrews at that time, kind of thought that that's what it was. And then all of a sudden, everybody changed. And we don't have that exactly documented anywhere, in any of the historical events, including the Bible, exactly why everybody in the whole world kind of went from thinking that there was like going to be 360 days to a year before the sun came back to the same spot, and realized that it was going to be closer to 365 days. But for some reason, something happened, and it did. So with not even having to know why, you can still work with what you got. And so the year then, of course, was broken down by months, and then the months basically by days. And the deal with the day is that we noticed that the day was not uniform. So when people started to look at the day, they realized that a day in January was not the same as a day in July. There were more hours of light and less hours of dark during the summer months than there were during the winter months. But they said, you know, we're just going to call it 12 hours in a day, and so the hour was not an exact amount. They still always had 12 hours. It didn't matter. They had 12 hours of light, they had 12 hours of dark every day, whether they were the same. So in other words, an hour was not exactly the same time. But that didn't really matter, because relative hours at the time, people weren't that precise, and it kind of worked. And it went on that way and developed into a pattern. And from there, they needed to basically come up with some way to designate this to somebody else, to tell them about what time of the day it was. So they basically created a clock. They didn't have a mechanical clock like we did, but they started charting time. And they decided that they were going to build their clock, or their start of the day, from evening till morning. And does anybody know why that would be a likelihood for them to pick that? Well, because that's what creation talks about. God talks about the idea that, you know, there was the evening and then the day. And so that's how traditional Hebrew got their time starting at the evening. That's not necessarily biblical. There's a lot of biblical scribes that feel that the early Hebrews misinterpreted that opening statement and actually got it backwards. But whether they did or not is beside the point, because what happened was what turned into the traditional time way of keeping time is what counts, because that's what everybody did. So whether there was a rational reason or whether they got it wrong. So what they did was they started their day in the evening, so approximately like 6 o'clock. And so when the sun was going down and it was changing to night. So the beginning of night became the beginning of the day. And halfway through the night, 6 hours later, we would call midnight, they were referring to that time is like the 6th hour of the day. And then when they bring the time all the way back around the morning, that would be like 12 hours later, and that would have been referred to as the 12th hour. So when the sun would be coming up and we would think of it being like 6 o'clock in the morning, that was basically their 12th hour. They were already halfway through their day, because they started their day a half hour earlier or later than we did. And so the way that looks is a little bit like this. Okay, so if we were using a clock like we're used to looking at today, their day would start down here. And then they would refer to time often in blocks rather than in individual hours, because things weren't that precise. They didn't even use minutes and seconds yet. Didn't exist. So hours was the smallest unit that they had. So it was very frequent to refer to something and say that in the third hour, this would be equivalent to 9 o'clock our time. So, you know, and so this sixth hour up here would be equivalent to our 12 o'clock, and their ninth hour would be equivalent to 3 o'clock, and they came down. Now they did talk in hours, and so the first hour, which is, they didn't have a 0 hour. We have a 0 hour. Right after midnight, there was no hours, and we only have minutes. You know, it's 20 minutes after midnight. It's not 1 hour and 20 minutes or some other kind of a number. It's just 20 minutes after. So what they did was their first hour ran, so they had like twilight or in the morning light, and then up until they got to their first hour, and then they had their second hour and the third hour. So they had no hours until they got to the first. So they incorporated that entire time period up through, so that they would call everything from the start of the day till 2 o'clock as the first hour, because the hour would run from the first to the second. But their hour didn't start exactly. It waited until the sun came up. So that was first hour, then ran to here. So this is 0 hour, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. It has to be that way for it to work out numerically. And they were smart enough to realize that, and so their clock ended up working just fine. They had basic hour clock. They had they just didn't call it 0 at the beginning, but that's okay. And everybody kind of got along with it. It worked pretty good. And it was all based off of the idea that the sun came up in the morning. Okay? And so when sunrise, this first hour here that I was saying, which is kind of unusual, is that it's like 72 minutes after the real time. In other words, the time between when the day would start technically, because of there was light, it wasn't, the sun didn't break the horizon yet. So and that generally occurred like 72 minutes later. So, you know, kind of a deal like that. So, but they basically told time in hour blocks, no minutes or seconds. And that didn't work too bad because they had a reference. They had the reference of the sun. And then they had a secondary reference of the sun not only coming up and breaking the horizon, they also had a reference of the sun at noon, because at noon the sun was at the highest spot in the sky that it would get. So they got a new reference again. So if you didn't have a wristwatch, and you didn't have a cell phone, you knew at least 6 hour blocks. Okay, that's why they kind of just told times in blocks. You know, you knew that it was sunrise, and then you had noon, and once again, then you had sunset. So that gave you a third time of the day. So you had markers so that you could tell what time you were without any mechanical assistance, just basically by looking up at the sun. But then they had night. Okay, actually they had night first, but it doesn't matter, because in a circle things just keep going around and around. You can pick any starting point or finishing point you want. But at night, they had no sun to use as a reference. They had no idea what time it was unless they created it. So what they did was, and I'm going to take out these inside numbers I put on here just so it's not maybe as confusing, is that they decided to tell time in bigger blocks instead of even worrying about hours, because they had no really easy way to do that at night. So what they decided to do was that they're going to break this dark period up into 3 blocks. So they start down here, and this is going to be the start of the night. So when the sun set down here, that would be the start, and they called it a watch. And that was because the most important thing that went on at night was the guard duty, either from enemies, watching animals, or whatever. So there were watch times, and you're not likely to stay awake all night, so they broke the night up into thirds. Okay, so they had 3 watches, and first watch, second watch, third watch. That was pretty simple. Worked pretty good for the Hebrews. They did this for a long time. They also did use the idea of hours that they did in the daytime could be used at night. It kind of really wasn't. Much later on, by the time of Jesus and whatever, then it was becoming more popular to use the idea of breaking the night down into hours rather than just watches. But what happened was that the Romans came along, and when the Romans came along, they had their own system. It was way advanced over what the Hebrews are using. First off, they realized that by this time that it took 365 and a quarter days to go around the sun in one complete cycle. So that gave them a much better starting point on measuring time. And so what they did, they also worked on hours, and they worked on the same system. There was no real need to change. They worked on 12 hours too. They had 12 hours in the daytime and 12 hours at night, almost identical to what we do on our clock. So if you think about modern day clock and think of the Roman clock, and this Roman clock came into existence in like 45 BC. Okay. Unfortunately or fortunately, it was not picked up as the way of telling time in Israel. The Hebrews just held on to their own way of telling time, so they still, had the start of the day at sundown, and they counted the first hour on up, so that what we would call 12 o'clock, they were still calling the 6th hour, because that was halfway around the first time. But what it did become popular, and even Jesus used it himself, was the idea of the watches. The Romans decided that breaking the night down into just 3 sections wasn't really accurate enough. So they decided that they were going to have watches as well, but they were going to have 4 watches in a night instead of 3. And so the first watch would occur here, and this would be the first watch, and then this would be the watch number 2, and then the third watch over here, and then this would be back down here for the 4th watch. So they had 1, 2, 3, 4, and they because they were more interested in telling time more accurately. And if you needed to tell time even better than that, you could designate it by the hour. But that was it wasn't that popular to do that. There wasn't that much going on at night. When you don't have a flashlight, it's dark. And so what can you do totally in the dark? I mean, a candle is doesn't give you a whole lot of light to do a whole lot of work with. So it wasn't that way. So what we have here is the beginning of keeping time with some kind of similarity, so you could refer to other groups and have people show up at the synagogue at the right time, or have them be able to participate in morning prayer or know what day a holiday was. They needed the time of the day. Okay, so that's what they did. So the Hebrew clock starts at 6 o'clock at the bottom, and this was for the daytime deal again, because it's the way. So it started down here, and they referred to this as the 6th hour, and so this was the first, second, third, all the way around. They'd come back to 12, and then if they were going to count to 12 again at night, they could do that as well. So they told time in the daytime by hour blocks starting at sunset. They told time at night by watches, which were 3-hour blocks. After the Romans came in and they actually took over and were controlling that area in about 63 BC. Then they switched to the Hebrews switched to the Roman way of telling night, which was 4 watches. They kept the Hebrew way in the daytime, but they accepted the Roman way at night. So that was, and you'll find that documented in the Bible. If you'll see Jesus talking about the crow and whatever. That's referring to the names that the Romans had for the different watches. In addition to calling them the first, second, third watches, they had names for the watches as well. And that was an interesting one because the crow calling occurred at the end of the third watch. Well, the first Roman watch was here. And the second Roman watch was here, the third was over here. At the end of the midnight watch, which was also called the cock crow, occurred at that time. And at that time, to signal people that were living in communities where time would mean a bigger difference. If you're a farmer out wherever you're at, away from most other people, you went strictly by the light of the sun. So you didn't get much accomplished until the sun came up. But if you lived in a city, there was something that was starting to occur. It turns out that some animals and some birds in particular, they realized that there was going to be some early morning light coming very soon, and they would start crowing. Certain breeds of chickens would start crowing in about the middle of the night. So what they did was they supplemented that by blowing that trumpet at basically 3 o'clock in the morning, which would be the end of the second watch. So at the end of the cock watch, they blew a trumpet to signal city people that it was time to think about getting up because, you need to get on with the activities. So I thought that was an interesting way because once again, people needed to have a trigger. And without the sun, there wasn't any triggers. And so the traditional Hebrew way of starting the day at night, when people talked, they often still referred to the day starting with the sun because that was the first activity that could occur. Even the women that were going to go down to take care of Jesus' tomb, they got up in the morning and they referred to that time of the day as basically the start of the day because that was the first that they could do something. So it was not uncommon to think of the first light that was possible was the first chance you got to do something. No city lights, no flashlights, it was dark. So that's the beginning of telling time that way.
Did cocks crow somewhere around there when they went to go to the tomb? Or not?
They probably would have, the trumpet would have already been sounded because I don't think they started down to the tomb until what we call the first light, which is a little bit after that. Before the sun rises, just, breaks the horizon, there's obviously a lot of light just before it does it. But there's a little bit of light before that, and it comes on very gradually. So sometime between 3 o'clock in the morning, our time, and 6 o'clock in the morning, our time, there was a significant amount of light. Like this morning, here at 5 o'clock, it was light enough that you could do virtually anything you wanted to do outside. So at 4 o'clock, you could get a lot of things done. And at 3:30 or, 3 o'clock, it was still pretty dark. 4 o'clock, somewhere in there, you start picking up light. At 5 o'clock, this time of the year, it's quite light. And so that was kind of the idea of working that way. But the idea that they needed to synchronize time, because you see, God lived outside of time, but he has us live in time. It's one of his creations, and it's to guide us, I guess. He doesn't go into explaining it, but it's something that we need to do, if nothing else, so that we can have the right anniversaries for things. God was very explicit about setting up the holidays. The holidays that the Hebrews went and followed were not things that they figured out or generated. They were things that were told to them by God. They were supposed to have this holiday on this day, and they were supposed to celebrate this concept on this particular holiday. So there needed to be a way of knowing when to start and when to stop. And so this idea of guessing when things occur needed to get less and less, and particularly as people lived in more developed cities and as time went on. And by Jesus' time, it was not, you didn't just say, well, we're going to pick a time, and we're going to pick the time that's real for the day, the relative time, by the light. So what they did was they didn't have a way to measure things with mechanical tools, so they looked up in the sky and they said, oh, just before it gets dark, we noticed that you can start seeing some stars. And so when you can see 3 medium-sized stars, 3 of them, before it's completely dark, that's the time when the day changes. Okay? And if you're on the other side of the day, and then there's that small time period, and then you could notice that, like in the morning, after it wasn't really ready to get light yet, but it was kind of getting light. When you could no longer see 3 medium-sized stars in the sky, that designated the start of the next day. So there was this period of unknownness in the middle. And believe it or not, even that short period of time got to be a problem with people. And so as the Jews still follow today, just before the change of the day, they change early, just not to miss it. So they pick a few minutes early, so that if the holiday is going to start at, let's say the sun that particular day of the season is at 6 o'clock, then 3 minutes before 6, they're going to consider that the holiday already. And then when the holiday is about to terminate the next day, and instead of terminating it right on time, they'll wait till it's 3 minutes afterwards, so that they make sure they cover the entire time as God had wanted them to do. So I thought that was people are really, we have our own way of doing things, and we can make mountains out of molehills, I think, sometimes, because I don't really think that that's what God's original intent was. So I'm sure He gives you credit for trying to do something as precisely and as accurately as you can, because whenever you're trying to do something for God, you're going to be rewarded for it. So I think that was good. So with the way as far as the clock is concerned, with telling the time of hours, the Hebrews came up with a deal, and they started at night, 1 hour increments. Okay, and then as time went on, the world realized that there was a more accurate way to be involved in doing it, because when you're working on a 360-day year, you end up that the seasons don't match. And so there was a correction factor that occurred every so often in the way that they added extra days into the year, the Jewish calendar year, to make it come out correct. So they compensated for it, and that kind of worked. And so they stayed with the telling of the time of the day, accepting the idea that an hour was not exactly the same in January. An hour of daytime of light in January wasn't the same as 6 months later, like in the middle of summer. So they could live with, because that didn't affect anything except for the stars stop of the holiday, and that they were going to play it safe, because if the stars weren't visible, they were going to do it a little bit early anyway. And that's exactly what they do today. I checked on that. It's traditionally done today. The Jews will start their holiday, just trivially early and run it trivially fast, so that they efficiently make sure they got it covered. So, but the difference turned out that that 4-hour block at night was too big. You know, it was too long a watch. And they quickly accepted the Roman one when it came up to time. Besides, the Romans were going to blow the trumpet. And so that made it, they put an extra marker in the day, and so that it was just accepted. And if for some reason you needed to have more accurate time, like I said, you could have hours at night, but that wasn't it. But the Romans were so far advanced, you don't realize that well before the time of Christ, they realized how many days it needed to be in a year and worked backwards and figured out how long, and you know, if you're going to divide it into 12 and 12, that they needed, you know, there would be a set time for an hour. Their hour was exactly the same time. It possessed the same amount of time, not like the Hebrew hour. It was no longer a relative situation. And then they developed the clock that we basically use. Yes?
I was just curious. God inspired the Hebrews to do what they did, but I wonder, because the Romans were pagans, who figured it out for them?
I think they did it scientifically. The idea is that they watched and timed and realized that you know how many days it took to they no longer used the moon as their base. The Hebrews, you see, had a combination calendar. They worked on lunar and sun together, and that's where the error, because the moon cycle being about 28 and a half days to go around the moment does not equal the right number to come out at 365. And so I think that's where they did it. But what God did was, it gave the Hebrews a way of telling time that was accurate enough for their period in history. And then from then on, you know, mankind continually wanted to know more and be more precise. So we went to that concept. But the idea of telling time at night, basically in big blocks, was, I thought, really interesting, because you didn't have a marker. You didn't know what time it was anyways. You know, unless you sat there and counted the seconds off or something, or whatever. However, I don't know. Maybe you had an hourglass type thing, or something simple.
Yeah, it couldn't have taken them too long once they got all of what you've already said done, figured out. It couldn't have taken them too long after that to figure out an hourglass, huh?
Right.
That's true. Something simple like that. Because if you're pouring water into a bottle from one, you know that it takes a certain amount of time minimum for it to go through. And so figuring something simple like an hourglass could have, you know, came along. But I've never actually heard of any one of them, an hourglass being used until much later. I don't know when they were invented, but there was probably some simple device that they were starting to be able to use. I don't know what it would have been.
Dale said, pagans would be agrarian, would be agriculture, would be, so they would have been using those cues, don't you think, maybe for telling time and seasons and stuff?
Right.
Well, sundials.
You see, that was all based off of the once they went to the sun as the major, the sun, and divide the sun into 4 spots in the year, when it, you know, when it was the closest to when it's the farthest away, and then halfway and halfway. That's what the crops follow, because the crops follow the temperature change, which is the orbit of the Earth isn't round, and we have, you know, winter and summer, and that varies with where you're at on the planet. But wherever you're at any one spot, if you stay there for at least a full cycle, you know, you're going to see this. And then, of course, if you live there, and you know, and they didn't have electric cars yet, so they weren't able to get around very fast, very far. So they were in one spot for a long time. They got to see the cycles, and the cycles were based off of the sun. And what the Hebrews were continually trying to do was to still tie the two together and use them both at the same time. And that doesn't work when you try, because somewhere there's a lot of people that think that the world at one time was based on 360 days. Because virtually every really old historical society had that number. And then, but it doesn't match the sun. Well, either the number was wrong everywhere by all these independent people, or maybe the time it takes the Earth to go around the sun changed. And there's theories of that. As to when there was a cycle period when the Earth came close, I think it was Mars, and supposedly, changed the cycling path. And there's also a natural cycling of the moon. The moon is always changing its time. It's not a constant. It's slowing down all the time. So one or the other or both or something that we don't think about created the world changing to 365 and a quarter days. Unfortunately, yeah.
What about the flood? Would that have changed it?
I guess it could have. It could have changed the tilt of the Earth or whatever, or made it the time period. But somewhere in there, something changed. Yes.
That's what I've always kind of wondered in my mind about Noah's flood, because it was so violent and total worldwide. I'm wondering if the Earth wasn't more straight up and down before that, and it kind of rock and rolled it and tilted it on its axis.
There's all kinds of theories like that. Unfortunately, it's not easy to, to prove any of that rationally today. But I believe, and I hate to pick a number because I haven't looked it up, and I don't remember things that well, but it's somewhere like around 700 BC or something is about when there seemed to be this major change. And so it occurred quite a ways back, and it wasn't that particular change where the planets got real close together doesn't synchronize with the flood. So, but the flood is another thing, by the way, that it's virtually in all of the early cultures. It's designated in some form. So we do have worldwide markers for time. The idea of keeping track on by the hour is pretty neat. And for these people, nothing more accurate than an hour existed. It wasn't until much, much later in history till we added minutes and seconds. In fact, it wasn't until navigation time when people wanted to start to sail around the Earth in boats, and they realized that was the way of telling distance, was by measuring accurate time. And so they needed some way to measure time more easily, and they wanted to have another, instead of saying 0.5 hours or 0.526520, instead of making a big decimal number concept, they wanted a smaller unit of time, so it was just easier. And that was when we added those to the system. So you have to think of that. The world, if you live back not that far away, nobody worried about being less than an hour away, being right. The only time that it made a difference was for the special Jewish holiday, because God says that it was supposed to be at a certain time. So the Jews were very particular about that. The rest of the stuff, they just didn't care. They worried about the seasons, which were based, they thought, off of the moon, which, was kind of similar, but not quite right. So they used that as a concept. So the whole idea is early timekeeping really started with the one that it continued on, was with the Jews, because we have records of the way they kept time and whatever. There might have been other groups of people that kept time previously, but there's nothing I ever saw recorded about it. So the Jews went for the idea of the 12-hour day, and I have no idea why you would think that there would need to be 12 divisions in a day. We don't have 12 figures. I don't know. So, anyways, we work on a 12-hour day, and we keep time now by the way the Romans do it, and which works pretty good. And the Hebrews like I give them a whole bunch of credit, they didn't want to follow the people that took them over. So they held on to their own 1 hour increments and just picked up the deal at night because that was a whole lot better. 4 was better than 3, and when they blew the trumpet in the morning, everybody knew what was coming. So that was pretty good. So, you know, gave you enough time to light your candle and burn it a little bit and get ready for the daytime. And that's what farmers do today. Most small independent farmers are up before dawn, and they're ready to start work at dawn, which means they've done whatever preparation they need to do, maybe ate a meal, whatever. And so you wanted to know what was coming up before dawn, so you get ready to use every bit of that daylight that you could. So that's about what I have for time. I hope you found it interesting. If not, the idea was that God kind of made it a necessity for humans to become involved with it, because he gave us stipulations, and we as mankind had to fall in path. And we do everything by time. I think it's probably the most considered aspect in our life today is what time it is. We need to know what time it is all the time, you know, and it rules our lives, and it started back then. So you can either blame God or bless him for the activity. And since he only does good things, then I think we need to bless him for it. And in return, why don't we stop and thank him for everything? Thank you, Lord, for everything, especially for this whole world that you created to put us in, so that we would have this place for us. And remember that we as caretakers could probably do better, but we still try pretty hard. And we appreciate the idea that you loved us first. It's much easier to love somebody back than to try to create a new relationship. And so to think that your Creator not only loved you first, but came to bail you out when we got in trouble with sin, makes us feel that you must think we're pretty special. And since you made us to be with you in heaven forever, why don't we all try to do what you ask us to do, and that is to love the rest of your creation, our neighbors, as ourselves. And we ask that you could help us do this. In your Son's name, Jesus.